Hello and welcome to this World Anvil video. We're looking at templates, and of course today we're looking at the template of species. That's animals, plants, sentient or intelligent, humans, elves and aliens included. So species are a wonderful thing to add to your world. Whether you're writing a novel or whether you're creating a role-playing space, species are integral to that. Unless there's nothing else out there except for humans, and even then, well, you could argue that there's the mutant type, the radiated type of human. All of those could be different species, but species nonetheless. Now, this is a wonderful template, a wonderful, wonderful template as usual from World Anvil. So how do we start filling it in? Where do we begin? Well, as far as I'm concerned, there's 3 steps we need to take in order to justify adding the species in the first place. You can't just add species for the fun of it. If they have no actual value to your narrative, what's the point? So there's the first one, is what is its narrative value to your story? If it's background filler, if it's just an alien that's going to wander through the cantina in the background, it doesn't matter. You don't need to fill in a template for this. Come up with a name, come up with a description, and you're done. It really doesn't need to go further than that. So it needs to be something that's integral to your narrative, something that's going to embody your theme, something that's going to really push your world forward, something that the reader, the player is going to encounter in a significant way, and that requires your attention. So if it isn't something like that, it doesn't matter. It doesn't need to have a template. Once you've decided that it has narrative value, you then need to decide, what does it embody? Now, if we turn to, say, Star Trek, for example, all of their alien species, at least in the 1960s and the 80s and the 90s when they were making the shows, all of their aliens embodied certain aspects of human psyche. Some were embodying the idea of greed. Some were embodying the idea of blind faith. Some were embodying the idea of totalitarianism. Others were embodying the idea of complete pacifism. So each race embodied a different aspect of the human psyche, and it worked for them. And of course, as the decades changed and certain races embodied certain cultures around the world, the Russians and the Americans were at war with one another. That changed. So the show changed and adjusted accordingly to allow that sort of thing to happen. So those aliens were based on that. What are yours going to be based on? It doesn't have to be aliens. It could be dwarves and elves. Are your dwarves and elves the same as we expect from, say, a Tolkien-esque kind of setting, or are they different? How are they different? This is where you're going to put them in. So if they have a narrative value, if they have something to contribute to your story, they go in here. You fill in this template. Secondly, you then need to look at the environment in which they come from. Now, this is particularly important if you have extreme biomes. So if you have extreme spaces where maybe you have a species that you've decided it lives in volcanoes, magma demons, for example. How has that changed them? How has that altered, let's say, for example, their anatomy, their morphology? What has been adjusted because of them being in the lava? If there's a magical field around, what changes the way that they reproduce? What's their growth rates? What's the biological cycle? You know, the template just really asks you a lot of questions, and you need to be prepared to answer those. So the environment that they're in often will help shape the creature. So if they spend all their time in the air, they're not likely to have big, bulky muscles. They're likely to be sort of elongated, look more like birds than, say, elephants. Those are the things that you need to then bring into that. And what that does is, by looking at the environment and adjusting the alien or the animal or the species to have evolved in that space, to live in that space, it makes it feel real. It makes it feel a little bit more believable than just, oh, it's got a hard exoskeleton that leaks acid everywhere. That seems very implausible when you look at it on the surface. When you then change it and say, oh no, actually that's a genetically engineered creature, well, now it starts to make more sense. Now it starts to look more like a biological weapon than an actual species that evolved. Aha, now we're starting to fill in some blanks. And that, of course, references the Aliens films of the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the noughties, and the subsequent editions, Prometheus and Revenant. So that's an interesting way that world has evolved and changed. Whether that was originally the plan, Who knows? Anyway, so it's a good example of how additional information can be released over time to your viewer, to your reader, to your player. And it's information that was all stored in a template very much like this one, or it should have been anyway, if it wasn't. Now, and then the last thing is we've got sapient species here as well. How do they organize themselves? How do they do those sort of things? What is your inspiration? Now, frequently, when trying to come up with unique aliens, with unique species, you sit there going, well, I certainly know that my inspiration for my fantasy world, I fell very heavily onto ancient cultures and civilizations. I find them absolutely fascinating. But then I swapped things around. So I said, okay, well, these are more like Greeks, but they're more, say, they're totalitarian rather than democratic. These are more like democratic Nazis. These are more like this. These are more like that. So I've played around with the cultures, but I have fallen back onto cultures to try and give myself some inspiration. You need to start somewhere, but it can be so overwhelming sometimes that you don't know where to start. So if you've looked at their purpose, if they have a purpose within your narrative, and they do have one, that's check number one. Check number two is the environment that they grew up in. What does that do in terms of shaping them, physically shaping them, as well as mentally shaping them? That lava demon probably has no concept of bartering, perhaps, because what are you going to barter when you live in a volcano? Are you very social when you live in a volcano? I don't know. Do you sort of like have sauna parties and invite people over? I digress. Anyway. Environment affects a whole lot of things, how they look at. Then you get inspiration. And that inspiration could quite be, I want my entire species to be like that one man. Or I want my entire species to be like that one woman. What happens if we take gender out of the equation? What happens if we add gender into the equation? Find your inspiration that you don't have to draw in completely. You can mix and use, but you can sometimes just need a little push in the right direction to set you on your way. And now, of course, with this template from World Anvil, you have no excuse not to have a completely formulated race whatsoever. Anyway, until next time, light up the forge.